Navy SEAL and his loyal canine save a mourning mother and her puppies from a cartel ambush. In the desolate borderlands of southwest Texas, where the desert swallows screams and the law ends at the edge of town, a widowed mother fights to protect the last piece of her murdered husband's legacy. But the cartel that killed him wants her gone, her land seized, and the one witness to his execution eliminated. What they don't know is that a ghost has drifted into their territory, a man trained to hunt in shadows, a weapon the government spent millions to forge, and he's brought his own four-legged arsenal. Some mistakes you don't survive. Threatening the innocent in front of a Navy SEAL and his war dog is one of them. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if you want to support the channel, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. The November wind cut across the Texas scrubland like a blade pulled from a freezer, carrying with it the scent of creosote and dust and something older, something that predated the fences and the roads and the illusion of civilization that humanity had tried to paint across this unforgiving landscape. Piedra Seca squatted in a shallow basin 45 miles from the Mexican border, a town that had been dying slowly for 30 years, its population dwindling as opportunity fled, and only the stubborn or the trapped remained. The desert here was not the romanticized landscape of postcards, but a hostile expanse of rocky arroyos, skeletal mesquite, and zemla that rejected gentleness. At night, the temperature plummeted, and the darkness was absolute, broken only by the cold, indifferent stars and the occasional headlights of trucks that never stopped, only passed through on their way to somewhere else. 8 miles outside town, where the paved road surrendered to caliche and good intentions, a single-wide trailer sat on a patch of cleared ground, with sight lines extending 300 yards in every direction. No trees, no cover, just open space that could be observed, calculated, controlled. The trailer itself was unremarkable, sun-faded aluminum with rust bleeding from the rivets, but its positioning was deliberate. One access road, high ground, clear fields of fire. The man who had rented it 3 weeks earlier had chosen it the way a sniper chooses a hide, and for many of the same reasons. Lucas Brenner stood 6'2" and carried 210 pounds of functional muscle across a frame that had been forged in the crucible of Hell Week and tempered through 8 years of combat deployments across 3 continents. At 34, his face carried the weathered quality of someone who had spent years under harsh suns and harsher conditions. A scar tracing his left jawline, where shrapnel had come within inches of ending him in Helmand Province. His hair was dark brown, cut to military shortness despite being 14 months removed from active duty, and his eyes were a gray blue that seemed to perpetually focus on the middle distance, seeing threats that weren't there yet, but might be. He moved with an economy of motion that marked him immediately to anyone with training, each gesture purposeful, no wasted energy. The unconscious efficiency of a man who had learned that survival often depended on split-second advantages. He had come to this nowhere place, seeking what he told himself was peace, but what more honestly resembled absence. Absence of noise, absence of demands, absence of the faces that visited him in the dark hours before dawn. The teammates who had been standing beside him one moment and rendered into component parts the next, when the IED detonated under their vehicle outside Mosul. The VA had words for what he carried: post-traumatic stress, survivor's guilt, hypervigilance, adjustment disorder. Lucas had words for it too, though he kept them to himself. He called it Tuesday. He called it the price. He called it the reason he now lived in a trailer in the middle of nowhere with only one companion who never asked questions or expected answers. That companion lay near the trailer's door, 95 pounds of black and tan German Shepherd, whose designation in official military records was MWD Titan, serial number tattooed inside his left ear, trained at Lackland Air Force Base, and deployed with SEAL Team 3 for 4 years of direct action operations. Titan was not a pet. He was a weapon system, a tool of war as carefully maintained and ruthlessly effective as the rifle Lucas kept within arm's reach at all times. The dog's right shoulder carried scarring where the same IED blast that had killed 3 SEALs had peppered him with shrapnel, and his eyes held an alertness that never dimmed, even in rest. His ears tracked sounds Lucas's merely human senses couldn't detect. And his nose parsed the wind into layers of information, identifying threats and changes in the environment with an accuracy that technology still couldn't match. They had been together for 4 years of combat and 14 months of aftermath, bound by something deeper than training or function. In the places where they had operated, Titan had been more than asset or equipment. He had been brother, partner. The early warning system that had saved Lucas's life twice and the lives of his team more times than could be counted. When Lucas had been medically retired and Titan officially decommissioned, there had never been a question of separation. They were a unit. Where one went, the other followed. The routine, they had fallen into a pattern in the 3 weeks since arriving in Piedra Seca. Lucas woke before dawn from dreams he didn't remember, but whose emotional residue lingered like smoke. He ran, 6 miles through the desert, with Titan ranging ahead, the dog's conditioning as maintained as his own. They returned to the trailer as the sun broke the horizon, and Lucas prepared food with the same methodical precision he brought to everything, measuring portions, maintaining routine. Routine was structure. Structure was control. Control was survival. Afternoons were maintenance. Equipment inspected, weapons cleaned, supplies inventoried. The disciplines that had been drilled into him until they became reflex continued now, not because they were necessary, but because they were what? He knew, the familiar rituals that kept the present moment occupied and the past at a manageable distance. Evenings he sat outside and watched the light drain from the sky, Titan beside him, both of them silent, both of them watchful. Sometimes trucks passed on the distant road, their headlights sweeping across the landscape. Sometimes aircraft crossed overhead, distant enough to be silent. Sometimes coyotes sang in the arroyos, and Titan's ears would track the sound, but he never gave chase, his discipline holding even in the face of instinct. It was a life defined by absence and isolation, and Lucas told himself it was what he wanted. No complications, no connections, no responsibilities beyond himself and the dog who had earned his loyalty and blood. He had given 8 years to the Navy and left pieces of himself scattered across foreign deserts and mountains. Now he wanted nothing more than to be left alone, to exist in this empty space where the past couldn't find him and the future made no demands. But the desert keeps no secrets, and isolation is an illusion in places where the land itself is a road for those who know how to read it. Lucas Brenner had chosen this place because it was remote and uncomplicated. What he didn't know yet, what he couldn't have known, was that he had positioned himself at the crossroads of something that would make isolation impossible and silence unforgivable. The quiet he sought was about to be shattered, not by his choice, but by the ancient imperative that had driven him into the seals in the first place, the thing that no amount of trauma or distance could erase. The need to stand between the innocent and the predator, the refusal to look away when looking away would be easier. 3 weeks of peace were about to end, and in the darkness gathering over the desert, forces were already moving that would make retreat impossible and action inevitable. The town of Piedra Seca existed in that peculiar state of slow-motion collapse common to border communities whose economies had been hollowed out by forces beyond local control. Main Street stretched 3 blocks, anchored by a gas station on one end and a boarded-up hardware store on the other. With a scattering of businesses clinging to survival in between, the diner, Maria's Place, served breakfast and lunch to the same 24 regulars who had been eating there for decades. The feed store operated on reduced hours, its inventory dusty and sparse. The sheriff's office occupied a low concrete building that had been constructed in the 70s and not updated since, its facade bleached pale by relentless sun. Lucas came into town once a week for supplies. Driving the 15-year-old Ford pickup he had bought for cash in El Paso, Titan riding in the passenger seat with his head out the window, nose parsing the incoming data stream of scent. They attracted attention, the tall, silent man with the watchful eyes and the intimidating shepherd. But in a town where minding your own business was survival strategy, no one approached. Lucas preferred it that way. He bought what he needed at the gas station convenience store, paid cash, exchanged minimal words with the elderly clerk, and left. On this particular morning, the 4th week of November, with the temperature hovering in the low 40s and a north wind promising colder to come, Lucas made his weekly supply run. He parked in front of the gas station and left Titan in the truck with the windows cracked, the dog's attention immediately fixing on the environment. Cataloging movement and presence with the thoroughness of a trained sentinel, Lucas entered the store, grabbed a basket, and began collecting the basics. Canned goods, rice, coffee, ammunition for the 9mm Glock he carried in a concealed holster at the small of his back, covered by an untucked canvas shirt. He was examining a package of batteries when he became aware of raised voices outside. Through the storefront window, he could see a woman standing beside a battered Honda Civic, facing two men who had positioned themselves to bracket her, cutting off easy retreat. The woman was small, perhaps 5'4", dark hair pulled back, work clothes that had seen better days. Her posture radiated exhaustion and something harder, the tension of someone who had been pushed too far for too long. The men were younger, late 20s. Dressed in the studied casual of those who wanted to project strength. One wore a leather jacket despite the cold not warranting it. The other had tattoos crawling up his neck, visible even from a distance. Lucas watched the interaction with the detached assessment that was his default mode. Not his business, not his town, not his problem. The woman's body language showed fear, but also defiance, her chin lifted, shoulders squared, despite the disadvantage in size and number. The men moved closer, invading her space, their intent clear even without hearing words. Intimidation, dominance, the ancient dance of predators testing prey. In the truck, Titan had shifted position, his attention locked on the scene, ears forward, body language changing from relaxed vigilance to focused assessment. Lucas could read the dog as easily as text, years of partnership making interpretation instinctive. Titan had detected threat, evaluated the situation, and was awaiting instruction. His training held him in place, but his muscles were coiled, ready. The clerk, an elderly Hispanic man named Ernesto, who had operated the store for 30 years, appeared at Lucas's shoulder, his voice low and resigned. "That's Rosa Delgado. Those are Voss's men. This has been going on for months." Lucas didn't respond, didn't ask questions, his eyes tracking the interaction outside. One of the men reached out, gripping Rosa's arm, pulling her closer. She twisted away, and the man laughed, the sound carrying through the glass, ugly and confident. The other man moved to block her path to the car. Classic pincer movement. No physical violence yet, but the threat was explicit. The message was clear. You are powerless. You are alone. Resistance is futile. Her husband was Border Patrol, Ernesto continued, his voice carrying the weight of things known but not spoken. Miguel, good man, died 8 months back. Accident, they said. Aid, but people know. People always know. He shook his head slowly. Voss wants her land. She won't sell. So they make her life hell until she breaks or leaves or disappears. Sheriff won't help. Nobody will help. That's how it works here. Lucas paid for his supplies, his movements deliberate, his face expressionless. He walked to the truck, loaded the bags in the bed, and climbed into the cab. Titan's attention hadn't wavered from the confrontation, a low growl building in his chest, barely audible but unmistakable. Lucas placed a hand on the dog's shoulder, a steadying contact. "Easy," he said quietly. The growl subsided, but the tension remained. He started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, passing within 10 feet of the scene. Rosa's eyes met his for a fraction of a second, a silent plea contained in that brief contact. Then Lucas was past, heading back toward the empty desert and the isolation he had come here to find. In the rearview mirror, he watched the men continue their harassment, watched Rosa trapped between them and her vehicle, watched the casual cruelty of those who operated without fear of consequence. Not his fight, not his town. He had given enough, done enough, bled enough. The world was full of injustice. He couldn't fix it all, couldn't save everyone, couldn't be responsible for every victim in every nowhere place. He had come here to escape exactly this kind of complication, to exist without the weight of other people's problems pressing down on him. He kept driving. Back at the trailer, he unloaded supplies with mechanical efficiency, stowing everything in its designated place, maintaining the order that kept chaos at bay. Titan paced, restless, his routine disrupted by the unresolved tension from town. Dogs understood injustice on an instinctive level, recognized predator behavior. and military working dogs trained for protection carried an imperative to act that was nearly impossible to suppress. Lucas understood because he carried the same imperative, buried under layers of trauma and exhaustion, but never truly extinguished. That afternoon he ran maintenance on his weapons, field stripping and cleaning the Glock, the AR-15 rifle he kept in the trailer, the K-bar knife that had been with him through multiple deployments. His hands moved through the familiar motions, muscle memory from 10,000 repetitions, while his mind circled back to the scene outside the gas station, to the fear in Rosa Delgado's eyes, to the confident cruelty of men who believed themselves untouchable. He told himself it wasn't his concern, told himself he had no context, no understanding of local dynamics, no responsibility to intervene in situations he didn't fully understand, told himself that getting involved would shatter the fragile peace he had constructed here, would drag him back into the exact things he was trying to leave behind. He told himself all of this with the rational part of his mind that understood self-preservation and the necessity of boundaries. But there was another part, the part that had driven him to volunteer for the SEALs in the first place, the part that had sustained him through Hell Week and selection and years of combat, the part that made him fundamentally incompatible with standing by while the strong preyed on the weak. That part didn't care about self-preservation or boundaries or rational arguments. That part only understood one thing. When you have the capacity to act and you choose not to, you become complicit in what follows. As the sun descended and shadows lengthened across the desert, Titan suddenly went rigid, his body language shifting in an instant from rest to alertness. His ears swiveled, tracking something Lucas's human senses couldn't yet detect, and a low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. Lucas was on his feet immediately, hand moving to the Glock, his own senses sharpening, adrenaline beginning its familiar cascade through his system. Titan moved to the door, nose working, every line of his body pointing south, toward town, toward something his enhanced senses had detected across miles of open desert. The growl intensified, then broke into a series of sharp barks, the alarm signal Lucas had heard 100 times in combat, the sound that meant threat detected, danger approaching, prepare for contact. Lucas grabbed the rifle, checked the chamber, and moved to the window. The light was fading, the desert painted in shades of amber and shadow. He saw nothing, but Titan's reaction was unambiguous. Something was wrong. Something was happening. The dog's instincts, honed through years of training and combat, were screaming alarm. For a long moment, Lucas stood at the window, torn between the isolation he craved and the imperative he couldn't ignore. Titan looked back at him, intelligent eyes asking a question that transcended species. Are we going to act, or are we going to be the kind of men who look away? Lucas grabbed his jacket, checked his weapons, and opened the door. Load up, he told Titan, and the dog was in the truck before the words finished leaving his mouth. Lucas climbed behind the wheel, started the engine, and pointed the truck toward town. Just a look, he told himself. Just to be sure. Just to confirm that everything was fine and his conscience could rest, and he could return to his isolation without the weight of inaction. But he knew, even as he made the justification, that it was a lie. Once you start moving toward the sound of trouble, once you commit to action, even with the excuse of reconnaissance, the path becomes inevitable. Warriors don't investigate threats, they eliminate them. Protectors don't observe injustice, they stop it. And Lucas Brenner, no matter how hard he tried to convince himself otherwise, was still both of those things. The truck accelerated into the gathering darkness, carrying a weapon the government had spent millions to forge and a war dog trained to kill on command, toward a confrontation that was already inevitable. Just to look, he told himself. But Titan knew better, and deep down, so did he. The Delgado Ranch sat at the end of a dirt road that branched off the main highway, 3 miles outside Piedra Seca, 40 acres of scrubland that had been in Rosa's family for 3 generations. The property wasn't much to look at. Rocky soil better suited to goats than crops, but it had water rights to a spring-fed well and a location that made it valuable for reasons having nothing to do with agriculture. The house was a modest, single-story structure, white paint gone gray from sun and neglect, with a covered porch and windows that faced east to catch morning light. Behind it stood a barn, weathered wood and corrugated metal, large enough for horses the family could no longer afford to keep. Lucas killed the headlights half a mile out and approached slowly. The truck's engine, a low rumble in the darkness. Titan sat rigid in the passenger seat, his attention fixed forward, body language communicating urgency that needed no translation. As they drew closer, Lucas saw the orange glow flickering through gaps in the barn's walls, saw smoke rising black against the star-filled sky, and his foot pressed the accelerator harder. The barn was burning. He pulled into the ranch yard and was out of the truck before it fully stopped, Titan exploding from the passenger side in a single fluid motion. The scene materialized in fragments, his mind assembled with combat-trained speed. The barn fully involved, flames visible through every opening. Two men near a pickup truck parked at an angle, one holding a gas can, both turning toward the unexpected arrival, with expressions shifting from surprise to calculation. The house dark, except for one window, where backlight showed movement inside, faces pressed to glass. And from within the burning barn, a sound that cut through the roar of flames and made something primal surge in Lucas's chest. A dog was barking, desperate, terrified, trapped. Lucas moved without conscious decision, his body acting on imperatives older than thought. The two men were spreading out, one reaching behind his back where a weapon would be tucked into waistband, the other stepping forward with body language that suggested he was accustomed to intimidation working. They were making the critical mistake of thinking they had time, thinking this was a situation they controlled, thinking one man could be managed. "Walk away," the closer one said, his voice carrying bored authority. "This ain't your business." Lucas didn't respond, didn't slow, his trajectory taking him directly toward the barn entrance. The man moved to intercept, reaching out to grab Lucas's shoulder, and found his hand caught in a lock that rotated his entire arm against its natural axis, driving him to his knees with a speed that left no time for reaction. Lucas applied pressure that stopped just short of dislocation, his voice flat and empty of emotion. "Stay down." The second man cleared his weapon, a semi-automatic pistol coming up in a two-handed grip that showed some training, but not enough. Not nearly enough. Before he could acquire his target, Titan hit him from the side with 95 pounds of velocity and violence, jaws clamping on the gun arm with crushing force. The man screamed, the weapon discharging once into the dirt before clattering away. And then he was on his back, with a war dog on top of him, fangs an inch from his throat, a growl resonating from deep in Titan's chest that promised death if he moved. Lucas released the first man and sprinted to the barn. The doors were chained shut from outside, fresh padlock gleaming in the firelight. He grabbed the chain and pulled, muscles straining, the metal cutting into his palms, physics and leverage working against him, until something gave with a screech of tortured metal, and the doors swung open. Heat and smoke rolled out in a wave that drove him back a step. Inside, through the orange hell of flames climbing the walls and consuming the roof beams, he saw her. A German shepherd, black and tan coat matted with dirt and blood, chained to a support post in the center of the barn. She was barking continuously, pulling against the chain hard enough that the collar was choking her, eyes white-rimmed with terror. And even through the chaos, Lucas's trained eye cataloged the details that mattered. Gunshot wound on her left flank, partially healed, swollen belly indicating late-stage pregnancy, muscle deterioration suggesting prolonged malnutrition. And despite all of it, despite the fire and the smoke and the certainty of death, she was fighting, refusing to surrender, battling against her restraints with everything she had left. Lucas pulled his shirt up over his mouth and nose and went in. The smoke was thick enough to blind, the heat intense enough to sear exposed skin. And somewhere above him the roof structure groaned with the sound of imminent collapse. He reached the dog, who snapped at him reflexively before something in her training recognized purpose in his movements. He grabbed the chain where it attached to the post and pulled. The metal hot enough to burn even through the calluses on his hands, but the post was old wood and the fire had weakened it. It gave with a crack, and he had the chain, had the dog, was moving back toward the entrance with the shepherd lunging ahead of him, both of them choking on smoke, the world reduced to orange chaos and the desperate need for breathable air. They burst through the doorway as a section of roof collapsed behind them, sending a pillar of sparks spiraling into the night sky. Lucas dragged the dog 20 feet from the barn before his legs gave out and he went to his knees, coughing hard enough to taste blood, his hands blistered, and his lungs screaming. The shepherd collapsed beside him, sides heaving, but alive, impossibly alive. Titan appeared at his shoulder, leaving the second man zip-tied and immobilized near his partner. The war dog's attention fixed immediately on the shepherd, his posture shifting from combat alertness to something else, something that Lucas's smoke-damaged brain took a moment to process: recognition. Not of this specific dog, but of type, of purpose, of shared nature. Titan approached slowly, deliberately non-threatening, and touched his nose to the shepherd's, a greeting that transcended words. The house door opened, and Rosa emerged, her 2 children behind her. A teenage girl with her mother's features, and a boy perhaps 9 years old, with enormous eyes. Rosa saw the shepherd, and her hand went to her mouth, a sound emerging that was half sob and half prayer. "Reina," she whispered. "Miguel's Reina, you're alive." She dropped to her knees beside the dog, hands hovering as if afraid touch would prove this was illusion, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her face. The shepherd, Reina, lifted her head and licked Rosa's hand with a tenderness that contradicted the violence of the previous minutes. The children crowded close, the girl crying openly, the boy silent but reaching out to touch the dog's fur with reverent gentleness. Lucas stood slowly, his body cataloging damage that would hurt worse tomorrow, and turned his attention to the 2 men. They were secured, disarmed, and from the expressions on their faces, reassessing every assumption they had made about this situation. The first one he had taken down met his eyes, and Lucas saw the recognition there. This man had combat experience, enough to understand exactly how outmatched he had been, how completely he had underestimated his opponent. "Who sent you?" Lucas asked, his voice rough from smoke. The man said nothing, but his eyes flicked toward his partner, a micro-expression that told Lucas everything about the hierarchy here. The second man, the one Titan had taken down, was trying to project defiance despite the blood soaking his sleeve where the dog's teeth had found flesh. Lucas walked to him, crouched down, and spoke with the flat certainty of someone stating observable fact. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was attempted murder, arson with occupied structure. You chained a pregnant dog in a burning barn. That makes you something less than human in my assessment. He paused, letting that settle. So I'll ask once, who gave the order? The man's defiance cracked, eyes sliding away, and he muttered a name. Voss, Hector Voss, but you don't understand. You can't fight him. He owns this town. He owns the sheriff. He owns everything. Lucas stood, processing this information, his mind already working through implications and next steps with the tactical assessment that was his nature. Rosa approached, her children close, Reina between them, the dog's breathing labored but steady. In the distance, sirens were beginning to wail, someone having finally called emergency services. But Lucas knew with bitter certainty that help from official channels would be compromised, delayed, or actively hostile. Rosa looked at him, this stranger who had appeared from nowhere and thrown himself into fire for a dog he had never met, and asked the question that had no good answer. What happens now? Lucas looked at the burning barn, at the 2 men secured on the ground, at the terrified family and the wounded dog, at the weight of involvement settling on his shoulders like equipment he had tried to shed but couldn't. He thought about isolation and peace, and the comfortable fiction that you could escape responsibility by choosing not to see it. He thought about Miguel Delgado, Border Patrol agent murdered for trying to do right, leaving behind a widow and 2 children and a dog who had survived 8 months in the wilderness to return home only to be burned alive by men who feared what she might represent. Titan sat beside Reina, the 2 dogs watching him, waiting for orders, for direction, for the decision that would determine what came next. And Lucas Brenner, 34 years old, retired Navy SEAL, who had come to the desert seeking silence, made the only choice his nature would allow. "Now I make sure you're safe," he said. "Gather what you need. You're coming with me." They picked the wrong person to terrorize. They picked the wrong town to corrupt. They made the mistake of committing atrocity in front of someone who had spent 8 years learning to be very, very good at solving problems like them. And in making that mistake, they had started something that would end only one way, completely, decisively, permanently. Lucas's trailer had been designed for solitary occupation, but necessity compressed space into function. Rosa and her children, Sophia 14 and Mateo 9, occupied the small bedroom while Lucas gave them what privacy the thin walls allowed. He worked through the night in the main area, treating Reina's injuries with the field medicine skills that had kept teammates alive in places where evacuation wasn't possible. The gunshot wound was weeks old, infected but healing, the bullet having passed through muscle without hitting bone or organs. He cleaned it with antiseptic that made the dog whine but not struggle, her military training holding even through pain, then dressed it with gauze and surgical tape from the comprehensive med kit he maintained. The pregnancy was further along than he had initially assessed, her belly distended and movement visible beneath the skin when he palpated carefully. She was malnourished, dehydrated, her ribs visible through her coat, but the puppies were alive, their heartbeats detectable when he pressed his ear to her side. He established an IV line to push fluids, something he had done hundreds of times for Titan after operations, and hand-fed her small amounts of high-protein food that her stomach could process without revolt. Titan remained close throughout, his attention fixed on Reina with an intensity that went beyond professional interest. He brought her his water bowl without prompting, lay beside her when Lucas finished treatment, and when she whimpered in sleep, he touched his nose to her neck in comfort. Lucas watched this interaction with something approaching wonder, seeing his partner exhibit nurturing behavior he had never witnessed in 4 years of combat operations. By 3 a.m, Reina was stable, sleeping deeply with Titan curled protectively around her. Lucas sat at the small table, cleaning his weapons with methodical precision, while his mind processed the tactical situation he had inserted himself into. The 2 men from the ranch were currently secured in the bed of his truck, zip-tied and under Titan's previous guard before he had shifted to Reina. Lucas had called the state police, deliberately bypassing local law enforcement. But response time to this remote location would be hours, and he harbored no illusions about what would happen once official channels engaged. Aged with a situation where Hector Voss had his fingers, Rosa emerged from the bedroom, moving quietly to avoid waking her children, and sat across from him. Up close, in the harsh LED lighting of the trailer, Lucas could see the toll the past 8 months had carved into her features. Exhaustion lived in the hollows beneath her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly when she wrapped them around the coffee mug he offered. When she spoke, her voice carried the flat affect of someone who had processed too much trauma to have emotional reserves remaining. Miguel was Border Patrol for 11 years, she said, staring into the coffee. Good at his job, too good. 6 months before he died, he discovered a route, smuggling corridor through our property, through the arroyo that runs along the western boundary. He documented it, reported it through proper channels, thought he was doing right. She laughed, bitter and empty. The information went to his supervisor, who sold it to Voss. 2 weeks later, Miguel was dead, ambushed during a routine patrol. They said it was an accident, equipment failure, but I saw his body, saw what they did to him. Lucas said nothing, recognizing that she needed to speak, needed to give voice to things that had been poisoning her in silence. Rosa continued, her words coming faster now. Years of compressed rage finding outlet. Reina was with him, his canine partner. She survived somehow, disappeared into the desert. We searched for weeks but found nothing. I thought she was dead. I thought everything Miguel was, everything he stood for, was just gone. She looked toward where Reina slept with Titan. But she survived. 8 months alone in that wilderness, pregnant, wounded, and she came home. Came back to the only safe place she remembered, and they tried to burn her alive. Tell me about Voss, Lucas said quietly. Rosa's expression hardened. Hector Voss, 52 years old, second-generation American, legitimate businessman on the surface. Owns Voss Freight and Logistics, big trucking company. Respected community member, donates to churches and schools, sponsors little league teams. But that's the mask. Underneath, he's logistics coordinator for the Sangre Nueva Cartel, manages their smuggling routes, safe houses, distribution networks. My property sits on a primary corridor. He's wanted it for years. made legitimate offers when Miguel was alive, but we always refused. After Miguel died, the offers stopped. The threats started. What about law enforcement? Lucas asked, though he already suspected the answer. Sheriff Kramer has been on Voss's payroll for over a decade. $5,000 a month to look the other way, to lose evidence, to make sure the right people are never investigated. County judges too, Border Patrol supervisors. Voss has spent years building a network of corruption that makes him untouchable through normal channels. Anyone who tries to fight him either leaves town, disappears, or learns to keep quiet. She met Lucas's eyes directly. I filed complaints with the FBI 4 months ago. Nothing happened. The system moves slowly, and Voss moves fast. Lucas processed this information, his mind constructing the operational picture with practiced efficiency. A target with institutional protection, financial resources, and willingness to use lethal force. A corrupted local power structure that would actively oppose intervention. Federal authorities, theoretically on the side of justice, but hamstrung by bureaucracy and evidentiary requirements. And in the middle, a widow with 2 children and a wounded dog. The last obstacle to territorial consolidation. The tactical problem was complex but not unprecedented. He had operated in environments where official authority was compromised or hostile, where the distinction between legitimate power and criminal enterprise blurred into irrelevance. The principles remained constant. Identify the objective, assess available resources, develop a plan that maximized strengths and exploited enemy weaknesses, execute with overwhelming speed and precision. But this wasn't a military operation. This was American soil, civilian jurisdiction, where the rules of engagement he had operated under overseas didn't apply. Or did they? When the system designed to protect citizens had been corrupted into a weapon against them, when authority existed only to enable predation, what obligation did he have to respect structures that had abandoned their foundational purpose? As dawn light began filtering through the trailer windows, painting everything in shades of gray and gold, a truck approached on the access road. Lucas was at the window instantly, rifle in hand, his body language communicating readiness that brought Titan to alertness despite the dog's obvious reluctance to leave Raina's side. The vehicle was a police cruiser, but not Sheriff Kramer's. The man who emerged wore a deputy's uniform, young, late 20s, moving with the careful deliberation of someone approaching a situation he didn't fully control. Lucas opened the door, but remained inside the threshold, rifle visible but not aimed, a statement that was both acknowledgement and warning. The deputy stopped 20 feet away, hands visible and empty, his body language projecting more uncertainty than threat. "I'm Deputy Marcus Hall," he called. "I got a call about 2 men secured on private property, possible arson at the Delgado Ranch. I need to take statements and process the scene." "State police are en route," Lucas responded. "I called them directly. You can coordinate with them." Hall's expression flickered with something that might have been relief. "Look, I know how this appears. I know what people think about local law enforcement here, and they're not completely wrong. But I'm not part of it. I'm not on Voss's payroll. I took this job 2 years ago from out of state. Didn't know what I was walking into until it was too late. By then, I had a family, a mortgage, and threats that made it clear what would happen if I made waves." "Why are you telling me this?" Lucas asked. "Because someone finally did something," Hall said, and there was naked gratitude in his voice. "Someone finally stood up. Those 2 men you secured, Ramon Salazar's crew, Voss's primary enforcers, you took them down." "Down without firing a shot, and that's going to send a message through the organization. It's going to create fractures. And I want you to know that when this goes sideways, when Voss escalates, there's at least one person in a uniform who will tell the truth about what actually happened here." Lucas studied the deputy, looking for deception and finding only exhaustion and suppressed hope. Hall continued, his words coming faster now, as if afraid he would lose courage before finishing. "I have copies of incident reports from the past 2 years, reports that were filed and then disappeared from official records. Documentation of complaints against Voss's organization that were never investigated. Names of other officers who are compromised. Everything I've been able to collect while keeping my head down. It's not enough for prosecution, but it's enough to establish pattern. Enough to give federal investigators starting points they won't be able to ignore." The deputy reached slowly into his jacket and withdrew a USB drive, holding it up where Lucas could see. "This is insurance. This is my way out if I need it. But I'm giving it to you because I think you're going to do what I've been too afraid to do. You're going to force this situation to a conclusion." Lucas descended from the trailer and took the drive, their eyes meeting in understanding that transcended words. Hall nodded once, got back at his cruiser, and drove toward the Delgado Ranch, where the barns still smoldered, and state police would eventually arrive to collect evidence and suspects. Lucas watched him go, then returned inside where Rosa had witnessed the entire exchange. "Can we trust him?" she asked. "Doesn't matter," Lucas replied. "Trust is binary and the luxury of people with options. What matters is he gave us intelligence and the possibility of an inside witness. That changes the operational parameters." He moved to his laptop, inserted the drive, and began scrolling through files while Rosa looked over his shoulder. Incident reports detailed a systematic campaign of intimidation, vandalism, and violence stretching back years. Property owners who refused to sell finding livestock killed, equipment destroyed, family members threatened. 3 unsolved disappearances of individuals who had been vocal about Voss's activities. Miguel Delgado's death investigation, cursory and contradictory, closed within 72 hours. And financial records showing regular payments from Voss's trucking company to a dozen local officials, including Sheriff Kramer, 2 county judges, and a Buter Patrol sector supervisor. It was damning. It was comprehensive. And it was inadmissible in court without proper chain of custody and authorization. But Lucas wasn't thinking about courtrooms. He was thinking about pressure points and cascading failures and the way corrupt systems collapsed when you struck the right structural elements with sufficient force. His phone buzzed with a text from a number he recognized, a former teammate who now worked private security with connections to federal law enforcement. The message was brief and confirmed what Lucas had already begun to suspect. FBI has had Voss under investigation for 18 months. Evidence collection phase. Waiting for enough to take down entire network, not just one node. Your incident last night accelerated their timeline. Expect contact within 48 hours. Meanwhile, you stirred a hornet nest. Voss will escalate. Watch your 6. Lucas showed Rosa the message. She read it twice, then looked at him with an expression that mixed hope and terror in equal measure. 48 hours, she said. Can we survive 48 hours? Lucas thought about the 2 men secured outside, about the organization they represented, about Hector Voss receiving reports that his enforcers had been neutralized by an unknown actor who had military training and a war dog and no apparent fear of consequences. He thought about predators when their authority was challenged, about desperate moves and escalating violence, about the narrow window between intervention and catastrophe. "We're not going to hide for 48 hours, he said. "We're going to end this, tonight." Rosa stared at him. "How?" Lucas smiled, and there was nothing warm in it. Nothing that suggested civilization or mercy or anything other than the cold mathematics of violence, applied with precision. "We take the fight to Voss, make him respond on our terms in terrain we choose, with variables he can't control, force him into mistakes that create evidence federal investigators can't ignore, and opportunities I can exploit. Turn his organization against itself." He looked at Titan and Reyna, at the 2 dogs who had survived war and wilderness and had every reason to rest, but were instead preparing for another fight because that was their nature, their purpose, their choice. They wanted to own everything, Lucas said quietly. Time to show them they own nothing. Time to burn it all down. 12 miles outside Piedra Seca, the Voss compound sprawled across 80 acres of desert that had been transformed through money and arrogance into a fortress pretending to be a home. The main house was aggressively modern, all glass and steel and architectural statements, positioned on high ground with sightlines extending in every direction. Security cameras monitored the perimeter, motion sensors covered approach routes, and a guard shack at the single access road was manned 24 hours by rotating shifts of men whose jackets bulged with concealed weapons. The warehouse complex behind the main house served as the operational heart of Voss Freight and Logistics. 18-wheelers coming and going at all hours, their manifests documenting legitimate cargo, while hidden compartments carried the actual product that funded the empire. Inside the main house, Hector Voss sat in his office, a space designed to project power through minimalism and expense. The desk was Italian marble. The chairs were leather that cost more than most people earned in a month. The art on the walls was abstract and expensive, and chosen by a consultant because Voss himself had no particular aesthetic sense beyond knowing that wealth should be visible. At 52, he had maintained his appearance through careful attention, his silver hair professionally styled, his clothing tailored, his body kept trim through a personal trainer who came 3 times weekly. He looked like success. He looked like legitimacy. He looked like someone who had earned respect through business acumen and community contribution. The phone in his hand told a different story. Ramon Salazar, his primary enforcer, a man who had executed more than 24 people over the past 5 years with efficiency and discretion, was currently in state police custody along with another crew member. The barn burning that should have eliminated a problematic witness and sent a final message to the Delgado widow had instead resulted in intervention by an unknown party with combat training. 2 armed men, experienced operators, had been neutralized and secured in under 60 seconds by a single individual and a dog. Voss listened to the report from his lieutenant with an expression that remained perfectly neutral, a control he had cultivated over decades of operating in environments where showing emotion was showing weakness. When the report finished, he set the phone down with deliberate gentleness and turned his chair to face the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked his domain. "Military," he said finally, speaking to the man who stood near the door, his head of security, a former cartel soldier named Torres who had worked his way north and into Voss's organization through demonstrated competence in violence. "Navy," the source said, "possibly special forces based on the speed and precision of his movement." Torres nodded slowly. "Ramon is solid. He won't talk. But the state police involvement complicates containment. If this goes federal, it won't." Voss interrupted, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "I've spent 15 years building relationships, creating dependencies, ensuring that any investigation has to navigate through a maze of compromised officials and bureaucratic delays. 1 soldier, 1 widow, 1 dog, these are not threats to infrastructure this robust." But even as he spoke the words, Voss felt something he had not experienced in years, a sensation he had almost forgotten. Uncertainty. Not fear, not yet. But a recognition that variables had entered his equation that he did not fully control or understand. Who was this man? What was his connection to the Delgado woman? Why had he chosen this particular moment to involve himself in a situation that any rational actor would avoid? "Find out everything," Voss ordered. "Name, background, what brought him here, what he wants, and while you're gathering information, send a message. 3 teams. 1 to the trailer where he's apparently taken the Delgado family. 1 to the ranch, finish what should have been finished last night. 1 to the town, make it clear that anyone who helped him or provides him sanctuary will regret it. Overwhelming response, disproportionate escalation. Make the cost of resistance too high to sustain." Torres hesitated, a rare moment of uncertainty from a man not given to doubt. If he's military, especially special forces, getting him directly might what? Voss turned from the window, his voice dropping to the quiet register that his people had learned was more dangerous than shouting. "He's 1 man, 1 retired soldier playing hero in a situation he doesn't understand. I own this territory. I own the infrastructure. I own the people who are supposed to stop people like him. What I don't own are complications that threaten years of careful construction. So you will eliminate the complication. Tonight, completely. Do you understand?" Torres nodded once and left to mobilize resources. Voss returned his attention to the windows, to the empire visible in the compound below, in the town beyond, in the networks of corruption and control that extended through the county and into the state. He had built this through patience and precision, through understanding that true power came not from being the strongest, but from being the most connected, the most essential, the most expensive to remove. 1 soldier would learn what everyone else in this territory had learned. Resistance was futile. Justice was a fiction. Power answered only to greater power, and there was no greater power here than Hector Voss. Meanwhile, as darkness settled over the desert and temperature plummeted toward freezing, Lucas Brenner moved through the trailer with economic precision, preparing for contact he knew was inevitable. He had fortified the approach, using his truck and several large rocks to create a channelized path that would force any vehicle into a kill zone covered by rifle fire from the trailer windows. Motion sensors borrowed from his personal equipment created an early warning perimeter. He had cleared fields of fire, identified fallback positions, and established contingencies for multiple scenarios ranging from probing attack to sustained assault. Rosa and her children occupied the bathroom, the most defensible interior position with no external windows and solid walls on 3 sides. He had given Rosa a pistol, a compact 9mm, and spent 30 minutes teaching her the basics. Sight picture, trigger control, shoot until the threat stops moving. She handled the weapon with the careful terror of someone who understood exactly what it represented. But when he asked if she could use it if her children's lives depended on it, her eyes hardened and she nodded once. Raina remained in the bedroom, her condition improved but still fragile, Titan positioned beside her, in a posture that was both protective and vigilant. The war dog understood that contact was coming. His enhanced senses detecting Lucas's preparations and interpreting them correctly. He was ready, waiting, every muscle coiled with potential violence that would release on command. Lucas checked his weapons for the 4th time, ritual more than necessity, his hands moving through the familiar patterns while his mind wargamed scenarios. 3 rifles, 2 pistols, ammunition sufficient for sustained engagement. Body armor that would stop anything short of rifle rounds. Night vision that would turn darkness into advantage, and skills purchased through years of training and combat. Skills that made him a weapon more dangerous than anything he carried. The motion sensors chimed at 2200 hours, subtle vibration against his wrist from the watch interface. Vehicle approaching, still 2 miles out, speed suggesting no attempt at stealth. Lucas moved to the window, rifle up, eye to scope, scanning the darkness through night vision that rendered the landscape in shades of green. 3 sets of headlights. Converging on his position from different angles, coordinated assault. Professional, organized. Exactly what he had expected. He keyed the radio to the frequency he had given Deputy Hall, speaking quietly. 3 vehicles inbound to my position. Armed response likely. Record this. Whatever happens next, record it. Hall's voice crackled back, tense but steady. Recording. State police are 30 minutes out. Can you hold? Yes, Lucas said simply. Because there was no other acceptable answer. Then he moved to the bedroom door and gave Titan the commands that would dictate the next phase. Guard, watch, protect. The dog's acknowledgement was a subtle shift in posture, his attention fixing on Raina and the door, understanding that his role was defense of this position, while Lucas operated externally. It went against Titan's every instinct to separate during combat, but his training held. And his new imperative to protect Raina provided purpose that overrode the desire to fight alongside his partner. Lucas exited through the back window, a route he had left deliberately accessible, and moved into the darkness with the ghost-like silence that was the hallmark of his training. The attacking vehicles were committed to their approach routes, visible and loud, drawing attention while Lucas became invisible. Circling to position where he would become the ambush rather than the ambushed. The trucks arrived at the trailer simultaneously, coordinated timing that spoke to tactical planning, and 8 men deployed with the practiced efficiency of those who had done this before. They carried rifles, wore body armor, and moved in fire team formations toward the structure that appeared dark and unprepared. They were expecting resistance but not competence, expecting a target who would be contained and overwhelmed by numbers and firepower. What they got was something entirely different. Lucas fired from 200 yards, single precise shots from a position they had not anticipated, each round finding its target with the accuracy of someone who had made similar shots under far worse conditions. The first man went down with a leg wound that removed him from the fight, but didn't kill him. Deliberate targeting that created casualties requiring attention and resources. The second shot shattered a windshield and disabled a vehicle. The third punctured a tire. The assault team reacted with creditable speed, seeking cover and returning fire toward the muzzle flash. But Lucas was already moving, his position abandoned before their bullets arrived. He relocated and fired again. Different angle, different targets, creating the impression of multiple shooters. Both forces larger than one man with a rifle and superior positioning. The fight lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes of controlled chaos where Lucas dictated tempo and engagement range, where he exploited training and experience advantages that turned 8 armed men into panicked individuals making increasingly desperate decisions. When it ended, 5 were wounded, 2 had fled in the one remaining functional vehicle, and 1 sat with his hands on his head. Surrendering to a threat he couldn't see but had learned to respect absolutely, Lucas approached the survivor from behind, rifle ready, and spoke quietly. "On your stomach, hands behind your back. Make any movement I don't like and you join your friends." The man complied with the frantic speed of someone who had just confronted his mortality and found it wanting. Lucas secured him with zip ties, then keyed his radio. "Hall, I have 5 casualties requiring medical attention. 2 fled east toward town, 1 in custody. Crime scene is secure." "Copy," Hall responded, and there was audible shock in his voice. "You took on 8 armed men, alone." "They brought 8, Lucas said. "I only needed 1. Tell the state police they can approach safely. And tell Voss I'm done reacting. From this point forward, I'm acting, and his move just gave me everything I need to finish this." He moved back to the trailer where Rosa emerged from the bathroom with her children. All 3 of them shaking but alive, untouched, protected. Sophia looked at him with an expression mixing awe and fear, and Matteo asked the question that his 14-year-old sister was too overwhelmed to voice. "Are they coming back?" Lucas looked at the child, this 9-year-old boy who had already seen too much, lost his father, watched his home burn, and now witnessed the reality of violence necessary to protect what remained. He could have lied, could have offered comfortable fictions about safety and certainty. But he had learned in combat that you respected people, especially children, by trusting them with truth. "Yes," he said, "they'll come back, but next time we won't be here. Next time we take the fight to them, to Voss, and we end this." In his compound, Hector Voss received the report of his failed assault with an expression that progressively darkened from irritation to fury, to something colder and more dangerous. 8 men, professional operators, armed and coordinated, defeated by one individual who had turned their attack into a massacre that would require explanations, payoffs, and complications extending through his carefully constructed network. For the first time in 15 years, Hector Voss felt something he had thought himself beyond: fear, not of the man himself, but of what he represented, a variable outside the system, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated or controlled through the usual mechanisms, someone who operated by different rules, someone for whom the structures Voss had built were not obstacles, but targets. He reached for his phone and made a call. And when it connected, he spoke 2 words that he had never expected to use on American soil. Burn everything. The state police established. Lished a perimeter around Lucas's trailer, processing the scene with methodical efficiency, while EMTs treated wounded men who would face charges ranging from attempted murder to conspiracy. Deputy Hall provided his statement, corroborating everything, his body camera footage showing the attack and Lucas's measured defensive response. But Lucas knew this was temporary safety, a brief window before Voss's influence worked its way through the system and complications began multiplying. They had maybe 6 hours before legal protection became legal obstruction. He gathered Rosa and her children, loaded them into his truck along with both dogs, and made a decision that tactical necessity demanded. They weren't running. They were advancing to contact, taking the initiative while Voss was off balance, before he could consolidate defenses or activate the network of corruption that was his true strength. But they needed intelligence first. They needed to know the compound's layout, security protocols, personnel rotation. They needed someone who had been inside and could provide information that would turn an impossible assault into merely suicidal. Lucas made a call to a number Deputy Hall had provided, a voice that answered on the 3rd ring with the cautious wariness of someone who had learned to fear unexpected contact. "This is Father Gomez," the voice said, elderly, weathered by years in a harsh environment. "Father, my name is Lucas Brenner." Deputy Hall said you might be willing to help people who are trying to do the right thing in a complicated situation. There was a long pause, the sound of breathing, then, I'm listening. 20 minutes later, they met at the Catholic Church, a small adobe structure that had served Piedra Seca's faithful for 80 years, its walls thick and its windows narrow. Built in an era when churches also serve as fortresses against raiders. Father Gomez was 73, his face carved by desert sun and difficult knowledge, his eyes holding the particular sadness of those who see evil clearly, but lack power to stop it. He looked at Rosa with recognition and grief. I prayed for Miguel. I pray for you and your children every day. I am sorry I could not do more. You can do more now, Lucas said quietly. Tell me about Voss's compound. You've been inside? Father Gomez nodded slowly. He donates generously, demands recognition. I've been invited multiple times for dinners, for fundraising events, for the performance of being a pillar of the community. The main house is fortified, but not military grade. Security cameras, motion sensors, armed guards at the gate, and roaming the property. The warehouse complex is separate, connected by covered walkway. That's where the real operation happens. Loading docks, hidden compartments in the trucks, counting rooms for money, holding cells for people who displease him. How many personnel on site at any given time? Lucas asked. 15 to 20. More during active shipments. Less during quiet periods. Right now, after your engagement tonight, he'll be consolidating forces, bringing people in. He'll be fortifying and preparing for siege. Lucas absorbed this information, his mind constructing the tactical picture. A hardened target with numerical superiority and defensive advantages, but also a target rattled, off balance, making reactive decisions instead of executing prepared plans. Voss had survived through caution and patience. Force him into hasty action and he would make mistakes. I need to get inside, Lucas said. Close enough to gather real-time intelligence and create an opportunity. Is there a way in that bypasses the main gate? Father Gomez hesitated, moral calculus visible on his weathered face, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a key. Service entrance. East side of the property. Delivery entrance for food and supplies. I have a key because I deliver communion to Voss's housekeeper, an elderly woman who can't travel to church. The entrance is alarmed, but the code is simple. 0111. Voss's birthday, October 11th. His arrogance makes him predictable. Lucas took the key, feeling its weight, understanding what it represented. Father Gomez was committing to action, making himself complicit, abandoning the safety of passive observation for the danger of active resistance. The priest seemed to read his thoughts. I have watched evil operate unopposed for too long, he said quietly. I have buried good people and blessed the ground where bad people built their fortunes. I am old, I am tired, and I am finished being silent. If you can end this, if you can bring justice to a place where it has been absent, then I will face whatever consequences God and man impose. Lucas left Rosa and her children in the church, the safest location he could identify, with Father Gomez promising to protect them with his life if necessary. He took only Titan, leaving Reina to rest and recover, knowing that what came next required speed and stealth that a pregnant dog could not provide. He armed himself with the minimum necessary: pistol, knife, night vision, radio. This wasn't an assault, this was reconnaissance. Information gathering that would enable the actual operation. He drove to within a mile of Voss's compound and approached on foot through the desert, moving with the ghost-like silence that was the product of training and experience. Titan ranged ahead, alert but controlled, his dark coat rendering him nearly invisible in the moonless night. The compound appeared as an island of light in the surrounding darkness, security floods illuminating the perimeter, the main house visible on its elevated position, the warehouse complex sprawling behind it. Lucas circled to the east side, located the service entrance that Father Gomez had described, and examined it through night vision. Simple metal door, keypad entry, camera covering the approach. He studied the camera's field of view, identified the blind spot created by its fixed position, and moved into that space with Titan following. The key turned smoothly, and he entered the code with steady fingers. The lock disengaged with a soft click. Inside was a service corridor, concrete floor and cinder block walls, lit by occasional bare bulbs. He moved deeper, Titan at his heel, both of them shadows passing through a space designed for function rather than security. Voices filtered from somewhere ahead, Spanish mixed with English, casual conversation of men who felt safe in their own territory. Lucas followed the sound, mapping the interior layout in his mind, each turn and corridor and room adding to his understanding of the structure. He reached a junction where the service corridor connected to the main warehouse floor, and he stopped, concealed in shadows, observing. The space was massive, high ceilings supported by steel beams, loading docks along one wall where 3 18-wheelers sat backed up to elevated platforms. Men moved between the trucks and a partitioned area that likely contained office space. Their body language relaxed, weapons visible but not ready. They were expecting threat from outside, from the perimeter, not from within their own facility. Lucas counted personnel, noted weapons, identified positions that would be critical during an assault. Then his attention fixed on a space separated from the main floor by glass walls, a control room or office where additional figures were visible. One of them he recognized from descriptions, from photographs Deputy Hall had included in his files. Hector Voss himself, present at his operation's heart, visible and vulnerable in ways he would never have allowed if he understood how compromised his security actually was. The recognition crystallized Lucas's approach. He wasn't going to wait for federal authorities, wasn't going to rely on systems that Voss had corrupted or circumvented. He was going to do what he had been trained to do: identify the high-value target, develop the approach, execute with precision, decapitate the organization and let the structure collapse without its head. But not yet. Not with Rosa and her children vulnerable. Not with evidence still needed to ensure that what he did fear would result in justice, rather than merely violence. He withdrew the same way he had entered, silent and unseen, extracting with the intelligence that would enable the final phase. Back at the church, he found Rosa waiting with her children asleep on pews, Father Gomez keeping vigil nearby. She looked up as he entered, reading his expression, seeing the decision that had crystallized during his reconnaissance. "Tonight?" she asked. "Tonight," Lucas confirmed. "But I need you to do something first. I need you to call the FBI contact that Deputy Hall provided. Tell them everything. Tell them Voss is at his compound right now, that you have a witness willing to testify, that evidence exists linking him to murder and corruption. Create official record that will force their hand, regardless of what happens next." Rosa made the call, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was initiating. The FBI agent on the other end listened, asked clarifying questions, promised that a tactical team was being assembled and would arrive within 3 hours. 3 hours. Longer than Lucas wanted to wait, but necessary to ensure that what he did next would be supported, rather than prosecuted. He spent those hours preparing, checking equipment, reviewing the mental map of the compound he had constructed, gaming scenarios and contingencies. Titan rested beside him, conserving energy, his body language communicating readiness. This was what they had been forged to do. This was the purpose that had sustained them through Hell Week and deployments and the long aftermath. Not killing for its own sake, but the targeted application of violence to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. At 0200 hours, Lucas received confirmation via text from Deputy Hall. FBI tactical team was 20 minutes out. Staging area established 5 miles from the compound, waiting for Lucas's signal to move. The pieces were in position. The window was open. Time to act. Lucas looked at Rosa, at her children sleeping in the church pew, at Father Gomez, who had chosen to stand rather than kneel before evil, at Titan, who waited with absolute trust for the command that would send them both into darkness and violence. He thought about Miguel Delgado, about every other person Voss had victimized, about the system that had been corrupted into weapon against those it was meant to protect. "Stay here," he told Rosa. "No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you stay here until law enforcement you trust comes for you. Understand?" She nodded, tears tracking down her face, and whispered words that were prayer and benediction and absolution for what came next. "Bring justice. For Miguel. For all of us." Lucas checked his weapons one final time, keyed his radio to the frequency the FBI was monitoring, and spoke quietly into the darkness. "Wraith moving to target. You'll know when to come in." Then he and Titan disappeared into the night, 2 weapons aimed at the heart of corruption, 2 instruments of reckoning for crimes that had gone unanswered too long. Hector Voss had built an empire on the belief that power insulated him from consequences, that wealth and corruption made him untouchable. In minutes, he would learn that some things couldn't be bought or corrupted or controlled. Justice had many forms. Tonight, it wore the face of a Navy SEAL and his war dog, and it was coming for him with absolute inevitability. The compound's lights blazed against the darkness, illuminating a fortress that was about to become a cage. Lucas moved toward it like a shadow with teeth. Titan beside him, both of them focused on singular purpose. This ended tonight, completely, decisively, permanently. Some mistakes you don't survive. Hector Voss was about to understand which mistake he had made, and why it would cost him everything. Lucas entered the compound through the service entrance for the second time, but this infiltration carried different purpose. This was not reconnaissance. This was direct action. Titan moved beside him with absolute silence, both of them shadows, passing through corridors that guards should have protected but didn't. Their confidence in perimeter security having created vulnerability at the heart of their operation. The warehouse floor remained active despite the late hour. 6 men visible, moving between the trucks and the office space. Their attention focused on inventory and manifests rather than internal threat. Lucas bypassed them entirely, taking a maintenance stairwell that led to the second floor, where the glass-walled office overlooked the operation below. Each step was calculated, weight distributed to minimize sound, breathing controlled, every sense extended to maximum awareness. He reached the second floor and moved along the exterior wall, where shadows were deepest. Approaching the office from an angle the interior occupants wouldn't naturally monitor. Through the glass, he could see Voss clearly now, the man who had orchestrated murder and corruption for 15 years, who had built empire on the suffering of people who couldn't fight back. He sat at a desk, speaking into a phone, his expression animated, one hand gesturing as he talked. 2 other men occupied the space, both armed. Both positioned near the door in classic security formation. Lucas evaluated the geometry with tactical precision. Glass walls would stop nothing. The element of surprise would last seconds. He needed to control the space immediately, neutralize the guards, and secure Voss before anyone below could react. Standard room clearance against multiple hostiles in confined space, complicated by the requirement to take at least one person alive for testimony. He keyed his radio to the FBI frequency and transmitted a single word: execute. Then he gave Titan the command that released controlled violence. Clear. Lucas hit the door with his shoulder, the lock giving way because it was designed for privacy rather than security, and entered the office in fluid motion. His pistol tracked to the first guard, double tap to center mass that dropped him before his weapon cleared holster. The second guard was faster, getting his rifle up. But Titan was already airborne, 95 pounds of velocity and training, impacting the man's chest and driving him backward into the glass wall that cracked but didn't shatter. The guard went down with a war dog on top of him, jaws clamped on his gun arm, his screams filling the space. Voss was rising from his chair, phone falling from his hand, his face cycling through confusion to recognition to calculation in the space of heartbeats. He reached for a drawer where a weapon would be, and Lucas crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, his pistol barrel pressing against Voss's temple with pressure that communicated absolute certainty. Both hands on the desk, slowly. Make any movement I don't like, and your empire ends with your brain painting that wall. Voss complied, his hands moving with deliberate care to rest flat on the expensive marble surface. His expression had settled into something cold and evaluating, the look of a man who had navigated dangerous situations before and believed he could negotiate his way through this one. Below, shouts were erupting as personnel realized something was wrong, figures moving toward the stairs, weapons being drawn. Lucas spoke into his radio without taking his eyes from Voss. FBI, you're cleared hot. Multiple armed hostiles in warehouse. High-value target secured, second floor office. The response was immediate, the sound of vehicles approaching at speed, of tactical teams deploying, of authority that couldn't be corrupted or delayed finally arriving with overwhelming force. Lucas heard the loudspeaker commands echoing across the compound, ordering surrender, identifying themselves as federal agents, warning that resistance would be met with lethal force. In the warehouse below, confusion turned to panic as Cartel soldiers realized they were surrounded by forces they couldn't intimidate or bribe, that the protection they had relied on had evaporated. Some dropped weapons and raised hands. Others ran for exits that were already blocked. A handful opened fire and were neutralized with the surgical precision of federal tactical units that trained for exactly these scenarios. The entire engagement lasted 4 minutes, from Lucas's breach to the final suspect being secured. 4 minutes to dismantle an organization that had operated with impunity for 15 years. Voss watched it happen through his glass walls, watched his empire collapse in real time, and his expression shifted from calculation to something uglier: rage. The fury of someone accustomed to control, confronting absolute powerlessness. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, his voice tight. "I have lawyers, I have connections, I have judges and politicians, and people who owe me favors that go back decades. This is theater. This is temporary. I'll be out in 72 hours, and you'll be the one facing charges for breaking into private property, for assault, for—" Lucas interrupted him with voice that carried no emotion whatsoever, just the flat statement of fact. "You're going to federal prison for the rest of your life. Murder, conspiracy, racketeering, corruption of public officials. The deputy whose body camera documented everything, whose testimony is already recorded, whose evidence files are currently being processed by investigators. The widow whose husband you murdered, whose ranch you tried to steal, who watched you try to burn a pregnant dog alive as your final act of cruelty. The priest who documented your money flows. The FBI who has been building a case for 18 months and now has everything they need, gift-wrapped by your own arrogance." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a register that made Voss flinch despite himself. "But more than all of that, you made one critical mistake. You hurt people in front of someone who spent 8 years learning to be extremely good at solving problems like you. Some things aren't for sale. Some things can't be corrupted. And justice? Real justice eventually finds everyone." FBI agents flooded into the office, weapons trained, commands being shouted, and Lucas stepped back with hands raised and visible, allowing them to secure the scene. He identified himself, provided the concise debrief that summarized events, and directed them to Deputy Hall, who had documentation supporting every claim. Titan released the guard he had been holding at Lucas's command, the dog's discipline absolute even in the chaos, and positioned himself at Lucas's side, watching. Titching the federal agents with wary alertness. An FBI supervisor, a woman in her 40s with the bearing of someone who had run major investigations, approached Lucas with an expression mixing professional appreciation and jurisdictional concern. "Mr. Brenner, that was either the bravest or most reckless thing I've seen in 20 years. Possibly both. We're going to need extensive statements. There will be questions about methods and legal authority. But—" She paused, looked at Voss being handcuffed and read his rights, looked at the warehouse floor where 24 suspects were being processed, looked back at Lucas. "But you just handed us the biggest cartel logistics bust in the Southwest in a decade, so thank you." Lucas nodded once. "The Delgado family. Rosa and her 2 children. They're at the Catholic Church with Father Gomez. They need protection until this is completely processed. Voss has people outside this compound who might retaliate. Already arranged," the supervisor confirmed. "We have a team en route to secure them now. They'll be placed in protective custody until we're confident the threat is neutralized." She hesitated, then asked the question that was clearly weighing on her. "What made you do this? You could have walked away, should have walked away. This wasn't your fight." Lucas looked at her. This federal agent who represented the system that was supposed to prevent situations like this from developing in the first place, who had been building a case while Rosa Delgado lived in terror, and Miguel's murder went unavenged, and a pregnant dog survived 8 months in the desert, because no one with power had chosen to act decisively. He thought about isolation and peace, and the comfortable fiction that you could exist without responsibility to others. "I'm a Navy SEAL," he said finally. "Was a Navy SEAL. The training, the mission, the purpose, it doesn't turn off just because you retire. You're built to stand between innocent people and those who would harm them. That imperative doesn't respect boundaries or jurisdiction or personal preference. When you have the capacity to act and you choose not to, you become complicit. So it became my fight the moment I saw it happening." Dawn was breaking as Lucas finally left the compound, federal agents still processing the scene, evidence being cataloged, suspects being transported. He drove back to the church where Rosa and her children were being prepared for transfer to a federal safe house. Temporary protection while the investigation continued, and trials were prepared. Rosa saw him and broke into tears, not of fear this time, but of relief so profound it physically staggered her. "It's over?" she asked, the question carrying the weight of 8 months of terror and grief. "It's over," Lucas confirmed. "Voss is in custody. His organization is being dismantled. The people he corrupted are being identified and prosecuted. Your husband's murder will be investigated properly by people who can't be bought. You and your children are safe." Sofia and Matteo clung to their mother. The three of them holding each other with the desperate intensity of people who had survived something that should have destroyed them. Father Gomez approached, placed his hand on Lucas's shoulder, and spoke with quiet certainty. "You were the answer to prayers I had stopped believing would be answered. God sent a warrior when we needed one. Thank you." Lucas didn't know how to respond to that. Didn't have framework for thinking of himself as answer to prayers rather than weapon aimed at problems, so he simply nodded and turned his attention to Titan, who waited patiently nearby. The dog had performed flawlessly, had been everything his training promised and more, and deserved rest and reward and the simple peace of knowing his job was complete. But there was one more thing before they could rest. Lucas drove back to his trailer, where Raina waited. Where the pregnant shepherd, who had survived wilderness and gunshots and fire, had been resting under the care of a local veterinarian the FBI had arranged. He found her in improved condition, her wounds treated properly, her body nourished, but her eyes still holding the wariness of trauma not yet processed. Titan went to her immediately, touching his nose to hers in greeting, and something in Raina's posture eased. She recognized him, recognized safety, recognized that the danger had passed. Over the next hours, as Lucas dealt with the endless statements and interviews and documentation that followed major federal operations, the two dogs remained together, Titan providing comfort and presence that transcended training or function, offering companionship to another warrior who understood what it meant to survive when survival seemed impossible. 3 days later, in the early morning darkness of Lucas's trailer, Raina went into labor. Lucas assisted with the veterinarian on standby via phone, his combat medical training adapting to the requirements of canine birth. Titan watching with intense focus as 6 puppies entered the world over the course of 4 hours. 6 tiny lives, blind and helpless, squirming against their mother for warmth and milk, representing hope and future, and the possibility that survival could lead to something beyond mere existence. Rosa came to see them, brought by federal agents who were maintaining protective custody but allowed supervised visits to people and places she needed to connect with. She knelt beside the whelping box Lucas had constructed, watching Raina nurture her puppies with single-minded devotion, and tears tracked down her face. "Miguel's legacy," she whispered, "living on, growing. These puppies are part of him, part of Raina, part of everything we fought to protect." Lucas watched the scene, this widow finding meaning in new life, these dogs who had survived war and wilderness, now focused on the simple, profound task of nurturing their young, and felt something shift in his chest. The isolation he had been seeking, the peace he thought he needed, suddenly felt less like answer and more like avoidance. Maybe healing wasn't found in absence, but in connection. Maybe the way forward wasn't forgetting purpose, but rediscovering it in new forms. The FBI supervisor visited a week later with updates. Voss had been denied bail, his assets frozen, his organization dismantled. 43 arrests had been made across 3 states. Sheriff Kramer and 5 other public officials faced corruption charges. The investigation was expanding as cooperating witnesses provided information about networks extending beyond what anyone had initially suspected. It was, she told Lucas, the kind of case that agents spent entire careers hoping to make. "What about the Delgado family?" Lucas asked. "Protective custody for another month while we ensure all threats are neutralized. Then they go home. Their ranch, their land, their life. We're arranging compensation through federal victim assistance programs, restitution from seized assets, enough that Rosa won't have to work 3 jobs to keep her family afloat." The supervisor paused. "She asked about you, whether you'd stay, whether you'd be part of their lives going forward." Lucas didn't have an answer to that question. His terminal leave was ending. He needed to make decisions about what came next. Whether to pursue contractor work or find civilian employment, you're continue drifting through empty places, seeking peace that might not exist. But as he looked at Titan and Reyna, and the 6 puppies who were growing stronger each day, as he thought about Rosa and her children and the community that was beginning to heal now that the cancer of corruption had been removed, he realized that maybe the question wasn't about geography or employment. Maybe it was about purpose. Being a warrior wasn't about wearing a uniform. It was about standing up when others couldn't. Being a protector wasn't about active duty status. It was about choosing to act when action was required. And being part of something larger than yourself wasn't about formal structures. It was about connection and commitment, and the willingness to carry responsibility for those who needed protection. 3 weeks after the raid, Rosa and her children returned to their ranch. The barn had been rebuilt with insurance money and community volunteers, better than before, and Reyna went home with them, her puppies now old enough to travel. Her purpose fulfilled but her future uncertain. Lucas helped them settle in, helped secure the property properly, helped establish security measures that would prevent future threats from gaining easy access. As he prepared to leave, Sophia approached him with the careful formality of a 14-year-old trying to express something beyond her vocabulary. "Will you come back, to visit, to check on us?" Lucas looked at this child who had lost her father and nearly lost everything else, who had survived trauma that would mark her for life but hadn't broken her, who represented everything worth protecting. He thought about Titan, about Reyna, about 6 puppies who carried the legacy of 2 warriors, about purpose found not in isolation but in connection. "Yes," he said simply, "I'll come back." 3 months passed with the rhythm of healing that was neither quick nor easy, but was genuine. Lucas had returned to Virginia, to the administrative processing that accompanied the end of military service, to the decisions about what shape civilian life would take for someone whose adult existence had been defined entirely by war. He attended required counseling sessions at the VA, sat through transition assistance programs, filled out forms that reduced 8 years of combat operations to bureaucratic checkboxes. But something fundamental had changed during those weeks in Texas. The isolation he had been seeking no longer felt like answer, but like avoidance. He kept in contact with Rosa through weekly phone calls, brief updates that carried weight beyond their words. The ranch was recovering. Sophia was doing better in school, trauma beginning to integrate rather than dominate. Mateo was talking more, the silence that had worried his mother slowly giving way to the natural curiosity of a 9-year-old. And Reyna, the pregnant shepherd who had survived 8 months in the wilderness, was thriving, her puppies growing with the explosive energy of young dogs discovering the world. The FBI case against Voss and his organization had proceeded with methodical inevitability. Federal prosecutors had built their case with the thoroughness that came from having cooperating witnesses, documented evidence, and defendants whose arrogance had made them careless about operational security. Voss himself faced 147 counts, ranging from murder conspiracy to racketeering to corruption of public officials. His trial was scheduled for the following year, but his lawyers had already begun floating plea discussions, recognition that the evidence was overwhelming, and the best outcome was mitigation rather than acquittal. Sheriff Kramer had taken a plea deal, testifying against Voss in exchange for reduced charges, his career destroyed and his reputation permanently stained, but his freedom eventually possible. 2 county judges had resigned ahead of formal charges. The Border Patrol supervisor who had leaked information leading to Miguel Delgado's murder was in federal custody awaiting trial. The network of corruption that had enabled the cartel's operation was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, name by name. Deputy Marcus Hall had been promoted to sheriff in special election, the youngest person to hold that position in the county's history. Running on a platform of transparency and reform that resonated with a community exhausted by years of fear. He had called Lucas personally to thank him, his voice carrying emotion he didn't try to hide. "You gave us our town back," Hall had said. "You showed us that one person willing to stand up could make a difference. I won't waste that gift." Lucas had accepted the gratitude with the discomfort that came from being treated as hero rather than someone who had simply done what the situation required. But Hall's words had lingered. One person willing to stand up could make a difference. It was a simple statement that carried profound implications about responsibility and capability, and the choices that defined character. On a cold morning in late February, Lucas received a call from Rosa that broke his careful routine. Her voice carried excitement. Excitement he hadn't heard before, anticipation rather than the careful exhaustion that had marked their previous conversations. "The puppies," she said. "They're 8 weeks old now, weaned and starting to show their personalities. Lucas, they're remarkable, strong and smart and brave. Raina trained them the way only a military dog could. And I wondered," she paused, gathering courage. "I wondered if you wanted one, if Titan wanted a legacy to carry forward." Lucas looked at Titan, who lay near the window of the small apartment Lucas had rented while processing his transition. The dog's attention fixed on something beyond the glass, with the vigilance that never quite turned off. 4 years of combat together, 14 months of aftermath, a bond forged in circumstances that civilians couldn't fully understand. Titan was 6 years old now, middle-aged for a German shepherd, his body still capable but carrying the accumulated damage of years spent doing things bodies weren't designed to do. "Which one?" Lucas asked. "The male who looks most like his mother," Rosa said. "Black and tan, broad chest, eyes that track everything. Raina watches him differently than the others, like she knows he's special, like she's preparing him for something." 2 weeks later, Lucas drove back to Texas, the journey taking him across landscapes he had crossed in the opposite direction months earlier when he had been seeking isolation and escape. But this time the drive felt different, felt like movement towards something rather than away, felt like purpose rather than avoidance. The Delgado Ranch had transformed in his absence. The rebuilt barn stood solid and secure. Fences had been repaired. The house showed signs of care and investment, fresh paint and structural attention that spoke to resources and hope that had been absent before. Rosa greeted him with an embrace that communicated gratitude beyond words, and Sofia and Mateo crowded close, the children visibly healthier, less haunted, beginning to reclaim the lightness that trauma had stolen. Raina emerged from the barn with her 6 puppies tumbling around her in chaotic orbit, and Titan's entire posture changed. His tail began wagging, something Lucas rarely saw, and he moved forward to greet her with touching gentleness, the 2 dogs reconnecting with obvious affection. The puppies, emboldened by their mother's ease, approached Titan with the fearless curiosity of the young, climbing over him, nipping at his ears, treating this formidable war dog like a patient uncle. Rosa pointed to one puppy who hung back slightly, watching rather than immediately engaging, his attention tracking between Titan and Lucas with assessment beyond his weeks. "That one," she said, "the one Raina has been preparing." Lucas crouched and the puppy approached deliberately, not with the heedless enthusiasm of his siblings, but with measured consideration. He sniffed Lucas's extended hand, processed the information, then sat and looked directly into Lucas's eyes, with focus that was startling in something so young. Intelligence lived in that gaze, awareness, the genetic legacy of 2 military working dogs, combined with whatever innate qualities made certain animals exceptional. "What's his name?" Lucas asked. "We've been calling him Sentry," Rosa said, "because even as a puppy, he's always watching, always aware, always the first to alert when something changes." Sentry. Lucas tested the name mentally, found it appropriate, found it meaningful. A sentry stood watch, protected, warned of danger, embodied vigilance in service of others. It was a name that carried purpose, and perhaps that was what he needed. Not a pet, but a partner in training, a legacy to carry forward, a reminder that service took many forms. Over the following days, Lucas remained at the ranch, helping with repairs, spending time with the family, beginning the early foundation work with Sentry that would eventually develop into formal training. The puppy showed remarkable aptitude, learning basic commands with speed that suggested both intelligence and desire to please. Titan watched these training sessions with what Lucas could only interpret as approval, sometimes demonstrating behaviors that Sentry would then attempt to mimic. Grandfather teaching grandson the lessons that might someday save lives. One evening, as the sun painted the desert in shades of amber and crimson, Lucas sat on the ranch house porch with Rosa while the children played with the puppies in the yard. The peace was profound. Not the empty silence he had been seeking months ago, but the rich quiet of safety earned and maintained, of community healing, of lives being rebuilt. "What will you do now?" Rosa asked. "When your transition is complete? Will you stay in Virginia, find contractor work overseas, keep drifting?" Lucas had been asking himself the same questions, had been circling answers without committing, but sitting here in this place where isolation had transformed into connection, where running away had become standing ground, the answer crystallized with sudden clarity. "I'm going to train dogs," he said. "Service dogs for veterans dealing with PTSD, protection dogs for families who need security, search and rescue animals for departments that can't afford commercial programs. Take everything I learned in the military, everything Titan taught me about the bond between handler and canine, and use it to help people who need exactly what we can provide." Rosa smiled, the expression carrying hope that had been absent months ago when Lucas had first encountered her being terrorized in a gas station parking lot. "You'll be good at that. You'll change lives." "Maybe," Lucas said, "or maybe I'll just do what I can with what I have, where I am. That's all anyone can really do. Stand up when standing up is required. Use your capabilities in service of others. Refuse to look away when looking away would be easier." The conversation shifted to practical matters, to logistics and planning, and the shape of a future that was beginning to take form. Lucas would establish his program in Virginia initially, building relationships with VA facilities and veteran organizations. Sentry would be his demonstration animal, proof of concept, the legacy of two military working dogs channeled into purpose that served those who had served. There would be challenges, obstacles, moments of doubt and difficulty, but there would also be meaning, connection, the satisfaction of work that mattered. As darkness fell and stars emerged in the vast Texas sky, Lucas felt something he had not felt since before the IED that had killed 3 of his teammates and shattered the certainty that had sustained him through years of combat. Peace. Not the absence of trouble, but the presence of purpose. Not isolation from pain, but integration with meaning. Not running from the past, but carrying its lessons forward into futures that could be shaped, protected, and improved. Titan lay beside him, Sentry curled against the older dog's side, and Lucas recognized what he was seeing. Legacy. Continuity, the passing of knowledge and purpose from one generation to the next. His military service had ended, but his mission continued. The uniform had been shed, but the identity remained. He was still a warrior, still a protector, still someone who stood between the innocent and the predator. The shape of that service had changed, but its essence remained constant. And perhaps that was the lesson he had needed to learn during these months in the desert, during the confrontation with Voss's empire of corruption. During the fire and violence and ultimate victory that had restored justice to a place where it had been absent. Being a warrior wasn't about context or authorization or official sanction. It was about character, about choices, about the willingness to act when action was required, to stand when standing mattered, to protect those who needed protection, regardless of personal cost. Lucas Brenner, 34 years old, retired Navy SEAL, had come to Texas seeking isolation and found instead the thing he had needed all along: purpose, community, the understanding that healing didn't come from absence but from engagement, that peace wasn't found in emptiness but in meaning, that the way forward after trauma was not forgetting but transforming. Taking the hard-earned lessons of survival and using them to serve others traveling similar paths. He would return to Virginia with Titan and Sentry, would build his program, would train dogs and handlers, would create partnerships between animals and humans that could heal wounds and protect lives, and demonstrate the profound bond possible between species when both committed to common purpose. It wouldn't be easy, nothing worthwhile ever was, but it would be meaningful, and meaning was the foundation of survival. As he prepared to leave the ranch the following morning, the entire Delgado family gathered to see him off. Sophia hugged him fiercely. Mateo shook his hand with solemn formality, and Rosa held him for a long moment, whispering thanks that encompassed more than words could contain. Reina watched from the porch, her remaining puppies around her, and Lucas could have sworn he saw approval in her intelligent eyes, recognition that her son was going to good purpose, with someone who would honor the legacy, she and Miguel and Titan represented. The drive back to Virginia was long but not lonely. Titan in the passenger seat and Sentry in a crate in the back, the puppy already adapting to travel with the resilience that was his birthright. Lucas drove through landscapes that transitioned from desert to plains to mountains, through the vast diversity of a country that held both beauty and darkness, justice and corruption, people who prayed and people who protected. Somewhere in that country, someone was waiting for help they didn't know was coming. Somewhere, a veteran was struggling with demons that civilian world couldn't understand. Somewhere, a family needed protection that official channels couldn't or wouldn't provide. Somewhere, injustice was happening, and someone with capability had to decide whether to look away or to stand up. Lucas Brenner had made his choice, not once, but as ongoing commitment, daily renewed. He would stand. He would train others to stand. He would build legacy from trauma, forge purpose from pain, demonstrate that the most important battles were not always fought on foreign soil against foreign enemies, but right here at home, protecting the innocent, confronting corruption, refusing to accept that power made right or that individuals were helpless against institutions. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to this channel. Tell us in the comments what you would have done in Lucas's situation. Would you have walked away or stood up? Would you have sought isolation or embraced connection? Your thoughts matter, your voice matters, your choices matter, because somewhere out there, someone is waiting for a hero. Someone is hoping that when darkness comes, when predators circle, when systems fail and authority corrupts, that there will be someone willing to stand between them and harm. Someone trained and capable and unwilling to look away. Someone who understands that being a warrior isn't about violence, but about protection. That strength exists to serve the weak. That capability creates responsibility that cannot be ignored without cost to soul. Lucas Brenner answered that call. Titan answered that call. And now Sentry would learn to answer that call, carrying forward the legacy of warriors who understood that duty didn't end with discharge papers, that service transcended uniform, that being a protector was identity rather than occupation. The road stretched ahead, long and uncertain, full of challenges and obstacles, and moments where easy choices would compete with right choices. But Lucas drove forward with confidence born not from knowing the destination, but from knowing his purpose, to stand, to protect, to serve, until the day came when he no longer could, and then to pass the mission to those coming behind, ensuring that the chain remained unbroken, that the light remained lit, that somewhere in the darkness, guardians watched over those who slept peacefully, unaware of threats confronted and defeated in their name. Because when duty calls, warriors answer, and Lucas Brenner, retired Navy SEAL, dog trainer, protector of the innocent, had learned the most important lesson of all. The war might end, but the mission continues, always.